Right. I gotta say that I've got to say something that is going to upset a lot of people, but they need to think about all of what I'm saying. I think that this morning, after watching the Queen's funeral, I've come up with a very profound thought. And it's about white supremacy. You know, it's going to be hard for some people to take, but the reality is that white supremacy is alive and well in the world, and the world can't do without it. What we saw last night, what I saw last night in the ceremonial around the Queen's death and her around the Queen's death and her funeral was white supremacy in action, and and in a way, she was held up by everybody, every race on the planet, as one of the greatest human beings in the world. She just was. She was a very benign person, and she and white supremacy are a very benign force. The problem is that pride stops a lot of different people from seeing it that way. So, what I'm doing here, I'm going to talk to this bloody machine. I'm going to talk this idea out of my head so I can write it down later. I have to do it quickly because I'm having memory issues. I'm an old man. But as I looked last night, it was crystal clear that the center of the global civilization is what I always thought, undoubtedly centered in London. I'll say that again. The global civilization is without a doubt centered in London. The civilization, everything about it, emanated really from London, from the UK, from Britain, from Europe in general. You know, they've had their fights in amongst themselves and all that sort of stuff. But the reality is, the Europeans have always been the most powerful on the planet. The English language is the most important on the planet. Now, that's not to denigrate places like China, because China was a very advanced society as well. But like it or not, they were left behind by the European culture, the European global culture. There's not really what you might call. I'm comparing China because China is one of the most advanced countries on the planet today. The reality is that they display a Chinese form of the global civilization, which, like it or not, emanated out of Europe, and in particular, out of London. And so that could be seen loud and clear. It was an entirely white um, celebration of a particular individual who was admirable in every way to people all over the world. There are people who, of course, in amongst our society, in amongst our white society, who didn't like the Queen for all kinds of reasons. But they can't deny the reality of what she was. And what she was the most popular individual on the planet, for nothing other than being an old lady. So, you know, you can have film stars and you can have presidents and you can have all kinds of other people, but nothing I've ever seen would eclipse what I saw yesterday last night on the television with that astonishing display of British culture. It was the British celebrating a phenomenal individual who, in a quiet way, led the world. And what she was leading was not the politics of the world, but the civilization of the world. And that funeral was, you know, she if you think about it, it was also fallible, because in amongst the celebration of her place at the head of the civilization were several sons. We're a son and a grandson who are basically fuckwits, because even the greatest civilization on the planet can produce fuckwits, and in the case of Harry and Andrew, they did. And you know, do I think that Charles is the measure of his mother? No, I don't. But maybe, as I looked at those people, maybe Charles's son will be. He seems to have what the Queen displayed as human traits. But the thing about white supremacy and I'm not talking about white supremacists and pointy hats and stupid fucking robes. I'm talking about the reality of what the white society and the white culture and the white civilization has done for humanity. And what it does, in a way, it kind of knows that it's superior to all the others. So we have made superiority a sin in the modern world, because it embarrasses us a bit. And the people basically who have done that are the white people themselves, because they feel that everybody should be equal, when quite clearly everybody is not. But what they've done, and they did it, and as I looked at those soldiers performing those rituals last night, in that globally televised, billions of people watching it, a global televised event, they had included, you know, a very obvious black people everywhere. There was almost every one of those regiments had black soldiers, odd ones, not lots, but they were there. That was there was the benign aspect of that supreme society, where they reached out and included those other races in what they were doing. But what they were doing was entirely European in nature. It just was. And those people were very proud to be part of it. So in that pride that those black people participating as white soldiers did, was it sort of forces us to look at that sort of, is the word dichotomy, between, you know, the white race and the other races on the planet. You know, there will be people in the white race who will want to push the black people aside, but the white race in general doesn't do that. It tries to include them. But like it or not, if you look at countries like Ghana and South Africa today, and most of the African countries, and the African countries, like it or not, are at the other end of the spectrum, at the other end of the human spectrum. They're you know, what they've managed to accomplish in the world is literally centuries, tens of centuries behind the European culture. And the only way that they display any sort of advanced culture is when they display what they learned from the Europeans. You know, if they build a building, a 10-story building in Johannesburg these days, you know, that 10-story building came out of white civilization. They will all be wearing clothes. They will all be using tools. They will all be using materials that came out of white civilization. The white civilization is undoubtedly supreme on the planet. If you look at China as an example, you know, there's sort of pride. There's racial pride involved in this, and the Chinese and the blacks and the Indians and all these other people, they have their pride as well. But the thing is that they still fall back on, all of them, every one of them, they still fall back on technology and knowledge and engineering that was all developed in the West. It just was. And so the West is a general term for Europeanism, which is, as I said before, global. But in every country in the world if the European component is in charge, they do their best to include those other people. They don't try to denigrate them. They try to bring them in. So is that a form of white supremacy to do that? To go and say, here, come and join us in what we're doing. No, we're not really interested in coming and joining you in what you're doing. But, you know, we'd quite like you to come and join us in what we're doing, because what we're doing is centuries ahead of what you're doing. And that is the sad reality. And the reality, and so people will say, you know, intellectual people will say, well, you know, those people can be as intellectual as we are. They're capable of doing things as well. But they didn't actually do it. They do it now because we've taught them how. But they didn't actually do it themselves. Everything that they do that is of the same ilk as what we do, they learned from us. When the Chinese drive millions and millions of cars down great big freeways in between huge buildings in China, all that technology came from Europe. It just did. The Chinese are a more practical race than a lot of the others, including us in some respects, because they see it for what it is, they accept it for what it is, and they get on with it, and they are capable of improving it. The Africans just are not. And so there is a difference between races. There just is. And you know, when we talk about white supremacy, we try to deny that. We try to deny there's a difference. There is a difference, and it was crystal clear last night in the ceremonial around the Queen's funeral. It was the biggest global event since bloody World War II. And it didn't threaten anybody. It did its darndest to include every race on the planet. In fact, if you think about who was excluded, it basically excluded the lunatic planet, the lunatic countries like, and Russia wouldn't have been excluded but for the fact that they invaded the country next door to them. You know, the thing about white supremacy is it can be seen in a lot of different ways, and one of them is intellectual, of course, but another is the spirit of it. And you know, the thing about that is that Russia displayed the worst part of that spirit by doing what it's done in the Ukraine. But Britain displayed the best part of it by honouring one of the greatest people in this century. You know, the time of Queen Elizabeth is going to be seen by history as something quite extraordinary, because she came to that role as a pretty young woman. And it was largely a ceremonial role, but she brought the very best to it. She just did. So, do I admire the Queen? Well, yes, I do. And what am I doing here? I'm trying to I'm making notes about what I'm going to say and writing. Because, so why do we need to recognize this as a reality? The simple reality is that extreme event that we saw yesterday at every level tried to include other races, and you know, sadly, I suppose, or maybe it's just reality. The black races have accomplished the least, and the white races have accomplished the most. They just have. And there's a lot of people who would want to deny that, but it's like denying that it's a cold on a cold day, because it's a clear and present and complete reality. The blacks on the planet have not accomplished what the whites have. So that black and white dichotomy is something that we are unable to face up to, because it is so completely stark. So what we do is we lie to ourselves about it every single day, because there's this moral attitude to that all people should be equal when they are not. So what happens then is you've got to go and ask yourself where civilization comes from, and that's a very complex question. You know, what exactly is it? Is it knowledge? Is it attitude? Is it heritage and history? Is it, you know, I think more than anything else, it's probably attitude. And the attitude of that white society is that, well, yeah, we've accomplished a lot. What we've accomplished is obvious in every single city on the planet. When you look at the big buildings, and when you look at the commerce, and when you look at the economics, and when you look at the knowledge of the people, it all came out of Western European society. And you know, I shouldn't say Western, because Western is like a modern version, because at the time when it became East and West, you know, big part of that was communism, communism was one of those flawed things bloody us stupid white people came up with. Communism wasn't invented by the blacks, but it was adopted by them in many countries, because it's a simple sort of idea that people think will work. But other ordinary, you know, people who can actually think will realize that it can't work. And the reason it can't work is because people generally are not equal. They are just not equal. And some of us can accept it, and some of us just can't. But, you know, I'm sort of an old geezer, and I'm not equal to lots of people who do far better than me, and who have accomplished more than I did, and were more disciplined about the way that they live their lives than I was. And so I can look at them and see their success and accept the fact that I'm not their equal. because it depends on how you measure success. And so then measuring success, well, if you look at the Queen's funeral and think about it in a cultural sense, it shows an extraordinary success. That is, it's a cultural success, and it's also an intellectual success. And it's a moral success too, because all through it, as I said before, those people who run that society have tried to include those other societies at every level. They just have. And so now in New Zealand, I want to talk about how that's impacting on New Zealand as well. Because in New Zealand, we're going overboard to try to make it appear to the world that a Stone Age race that we found here 230 years ago is equal to us. Now, and I said before, there's several ways of measuring equality. If you give a group of people equality, then they are considered equal, and they can consider themselves equal. But you've got to stop and recognize who actually gave them the equality. Where did the equality come from in New Zealand? Came from the white people. And so was it white supremacism for the white people in New Zealand to elevate Maori to the point where they are now looking at Maori supremacy? Because, that process of bringing them forward in the minds of many of them didn't stop. They decided that they were more special than everybody else. And that's clear in the way that they are behaving. And that behaviour is being encouraged by shallow thinking people like Jacinda Ardern. Why is she doing that? Because she perceives it as giving her power. She sees it. She sees elevating Maori to a position of supremacy makes her a hero in the minds of the left, the global left. Because the global left would not be able to accept anything that I've just said here. It will be anathema to the global left, because what we saw yesterday in the Queen's funeral was the global, everything about that emanated out of the conservative mindset. Didn't come out of the left-wing mindset, none of it. But the left wing sure as hell wanted to be part of it, because it demonstrates the height of civilization. That was the pinnacle of recent civilization on display. And where did that pinnacle, that was the pointy end of civilization, sticking up out of the masses. It just was. It was the pinnacle of modern civilization, sticking up out of the masses. And where did it come from? It came directly from white supremacism. And you see, what problem here is that white supremacism has been made into a dirty word. So I've got to give it another title. But it is certainly white accomplishment. All of that marching, all of that whole display, everything about it, the coordination, the flags, the massive roads they marched up and down on, the beautiful cathedral, the everything about it, the fact that they could put all those world leaders in one space was something that couldn't be done in any other society but the white society. It just couldn't be. There's nowhere else on earth it could be done. There is no other form of the society on the planet where world leaders would trust the people in charge to bring them all into one room. Couldn't be done by anybody else. Only the white people could do that. See that? And so there we have another problem, the white people. Well, they sort of might be white, but they're actually, European. I don't like calling white people white because really their ethnicity is European. I'm a European. So as a European, I've wrestled with this little conundrum for years and tried to figure out ways to describe or explain it. But I do seem to, in the way that I look at all of this, is I kind of see it as a global thing, and I think the global component of it is obvious every day when I sit down to watch global TV. I can watch New Zealand television, but watching New Zealand television is like looking up the arse of strange people who've got in control of the media in New Zealand, and the media is just an organisation which people can take control of. So the media in New Zealand has been the control of the media in New Zealand has been picked up and run with by lunatics, people who unthinking people who are just they're just grubbing for power, political power, cultural power. But I sort of realised last night that it wouldn't matter what. I was thinking about Jacinda Ardern sitting there in that fucking church at the Queen's funeral, being part of it, and looking at the culture that she's busy trying to destroy. But she's never going to succeed because she's just a sad and stupid woman. And I'm not saying she's a sad and stupid woman to denigrate a woman, just her. There are lots of very smart women on the world, but Jacinda Ardern is not one of them. But so the New Zealand unthinking people, who I heard them in New Zealand television the other day. Like I said, this is just me making notes. On the New Zealand television the other day, they started talking about white supremacism, and they do it all the time. And it's because they're very, the people running the TV and the news media in New Zealand are extremely substandard people. And they demonstrate how substandard they are by the degree to which they've walked away and ignored and tried to hide the reality that they have an obligation and a responsibility to do news honestly, but they don't. They have adopted the news form that was developed by Joseph Goebbels in the Nazi regime in the 1920s. They are doing the bidding of the government. They are not doing the high-minded, the essential, it's almost like seeing a religion, a religion has a set of standards that they can never breach. The media needs to have a set of standards that they can never breach because they have access to the minds of the people. And for them to abuse that privilege by doing what they're doing today in New Zealand means that they're an extremely substandard group of people. And if you look at them, you will see a strong Maori influence running right through the news media in New Zealand. And so what that does in a way, people say it's a racist thing to say, but it's a true thing to say. if you put a bunch of people from one race in control, if you put a bunch of people from one race other than European in control of the news media, they will pollute it. They will twist it. They will subvert it. And they have absolutely done that in New Zealand. And I live in New Zealand, and so this is what I see. So I've got to comment on what's going on in the globe, on what is happening in New Zealand. And as a sort of microcosm of the world order, New Zealand is kind of isolated from everybody else by the Pacific Ocean and the Tasman Sea. And, we're desperate. We're so desperate about that we rabbit on about that idiot Jacinda as though she's something special. Well, she's just not. She is probably the worst of the European leaders in the world. And we think she's wonderful. Well, a lot of people do, but I don't, as will be obvious by this. But I've got to take myself back to this original concept of what I was trying to do here, and that is white supremacy and the benign nature of white supremacy. And is there any way that you can look away from white accomplishment on the planet? Well, there's not. I mean, we are looking at white accomplishment right now on this computer television set. This ability for me to talk to a machine and record it in a house that keeps me dry and warm, and glasses so I can see properly, clothes so I can stay warm, everything around me, which is shared by every, the other race in New Zealand, the other predominant race, which is Maori. Everything that they do is the same as what I do. And it's because they have adopted European white lifestyle in favour of Maori lifestyle, which and now with the help of the Europeans, they're trying to deny their original heritage, which was tribal wars and cannibalism and Stone Age. Stone and wooden tools mean Stone Age. So to compensate, we try to elevate the things that they did do to make them feel better. And so that statement that I just made then is the kind of thing people see as racism. But the reality is that the Maori in New Zealand live in white society. They just do. Everything about their lives, every single thing about their lives emanated out of what was originated really as a culture and a society in a technological age in Europe. Even American society emanated out of Europe, and they're the next strongest. Just came from Europe, came from white people. And what do white people do with it? Well, they try and share it with the rest of the world. Maybe every single one of them doesn't, but over here you could find 100 white supremacists who hate everybody else. But they would share opinions with the ones over here who want to share white society with all the people on the globe, and who want to be inclusive and pull the people of those other races into what they do and what they did and it was crystal clear. And every one of those bloody regiments marching about the place with such fanfare yesterday had very obvious black members, and they, not only that, they were put in prominent positions so they could be seen. So who are they trying to show them to? Well, there's two ways of looking at that. Are they trying to show that they're prepared to be diverse? So they've introduced this diverse word into society. They haven't introduced diverse into black society. They've introduced it into white society. Who did that? White people did. Because they're desperately trying to, they know that they're so far ahead of, at the pointy end of the other end is Africa. And the white people, the white society, the sort of the white, the core of white existence is desperately trying to show that they're prepared to involve the people from Africa. And they do that by putting them in prominent positions. You just do. Have a look at the people who got up and made speeches and whatever at the Queen's funeral. Diverse. Would Africans do that? Would black Africans having a big soiree in Africa make sure that most races were in some way included? No. The only society that would do that is European society. And they do that because they know, they know, and so do all the other races, but none of us are allowed to talk about the fact that European society leads the world. Just does. And it holds itself back, trying to pull all the other races along with it. And so what we do is we call that white supremacy. Oh, I don't know whether I'm doing this clearly enough or not, but anyway, I'm going to try now to go back and write this down, because when I write, I seem to be able to develop ideas a little better. But I know that what I'm going to say is something that needs to be said. I would have thought somebody else would have said it by now. Maybe they have. So, white supremacism. White supremacism is not a guy on a motorbike. It's not a guy with a white robe and a pointy hat. It is just simply the reality that surrounds every one of us, every day of our lives. And yesterday, at the Queen's funeral, it was projected globally in a celebration of one of the most amazing individuals in the 20th century. Longest serving queen ever. All she had to do was maintain a good standard of behaviour, which unfortunately her sons haven't really been able to match, or her grandsons. One of them might, and it seems fortunate that he might be the one that ends up with that kingship. But poor old Prince Charles, he's not respected enough to take up that role, but he will. And he could be the one to bring it down. But, white supremacy is not going to be brought down by... White supremacy cannot be brought down by any other race. To talk about white supremacy talks about a particular race. And white supremacy will be brought down by itself, not by any of the other races. Because, like it or not, if you eliminated every white person on the planet, white supremacy would still exist in every city on the planet. Just would. It just would. Thank you.